How does the food you eat contribute to your health? Do supplements help prevent disease? For the past 25 years, the Linus Pauling Institute has served as a world-renowned research center at Oregon State University. Our mission is to promote optimal health through cutting-edge nutrition research and trusted public outreach. We use a synergistic strategy, connecting several scientific fields to bring a better understanding to dietary components and the role that they play in obtaining optimal health. We provide that information to the world, allowing people everywhere to live longer, better lives. Welcome to the Linus Pauling Institute's webinar series.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the next installment of the Linus Pauling Institute's webinar series. My name is Dr. Alexander Michaels, and I am the Communications Officer for the Linus Pauling Institute. And it's my pleasure to be your moderator for today's webinar. Today's webinar is rather unique for the Institute. Instead of focusing on research topics and delving into the science, today we are going to actually change into talking about Dr. Linus Pauling, the founder or one of the founders of the Institute and our namesake. To do that, I have a special guest with us today, Chris Petersen from the Oregon State University Special Collections and Archives Research Center, also known as SCARC, which is part of the OSU libraries. Our time with Chris will revolve around his new book, Visions of Linus Pauling, which is available in major retailers anywhere books are sold, basically, online especially. But before I get too far into it, I would like to invite Dr. Emily Ho to come online and get things started.
Hi, everyone. As mentioned, I'm Dr. Emily Ho. I'm director of the Linus Pauling Institute. Really happy to see all of you here today to learn about our inspiration, Dr. Pauling. So here at the Institute, we often focus on Dr. Pauling's life in his later years when he spent time helping people live longer and better lives. But that was really just one small piece of his amazing career and his remarkable life. There's really so much more. And that's one reason why we have Chris Petersen here with us today, so we can learn more about many different aspects of Dr. Pauling. Before we get to the webinar and before we go on, I did want to mention a few things. So later this month is Oregon State University's annual Day of Giving. This is known as Damn Proud Day. For those of you who may not know, here at Oregon State University, we're known as the Beavers, hence the play on Damn Proud. But on Wednesday, April 26th, I want you to remember this date because we were asking for your help and support. For those 24 hours on April 26th, all the gifts that we receive on the Damn Proud Day website, no matter what amount and no matter what area you wish to support, all will go towards unlocking some special challenge gifts made by some of our generous donors. In a sense, these donors are challenging you to come support us. And when you do support us, the Institute will get extra money if we can meet the goals that we set for the day. The good news is you don't really have to do too much to help us meet these challenges. The challenges we have for this year are unlocked with just number of gifts, not dollar amounts. So just giving a few dollars will help unlock these additional gifts of up to $20,000. So encourage you to think about this. This year, we're raising money for a new fund that supports our students. We have so many amazing students here at the Institute. The fund is called the Hagen Butler Student Legacy Fund and is in honor of Dr. Tori Hagen, one of the principal investigators here at the Institute, and Judy Butler, his longtime research assistant. This fund was established in their names to continue and accelerate their passion for helping graduate students succeed. So please mark your calendar for April 26th, and I hope you can support us. You'll hear more about this soon, but that's it for now. I think it's time to bring in our speaker, and I'll throw it back to Alex.
Okay, Emily, thank you very much. So as I mentioned, Today's speaker is Chris Petersen from the Oregon State University Special Collections, where he's been working for the last 20 years. Chris has, or more than 20 years actually, Chris has learned quite a bit about Dr. Pauling in his time at the Special Collections. And that's because the Special Collections is a repository for Linus Pauling's papers. The Ava, Helen, and Linus Pauling collection exists at the Special Collections, right down the street from the Linus Pauling Institute Science Center. And so Chris has been delving into this collection since, before you actually were employed there, right, Chris? or as a student. And so during that time, Chris has actually produced lots of material, archiving and digesting this collection. Some of it is the Pauling blog, and one of the materials that he's published is Visions of Linus Pauling, which is based on the Pauling blog. I won't go too far into details on the genesis of the book. I'll let Chris do some of that, but we also did a special interview, which I released on YouTube just last night, that you can watch and go into some of the background, how this book was created. I didn't want to go too far in that interview because I didn't want to spoil today's webinar. So I'm going to let Chris go forward. Take it away.
Thanks very much, Alex and Emily. I will get my Zoom set up and then we will get started. Okay, Visions of Linus Pauling, Reflections on the Man and His Institute. Okay, so what are we going to do? We're going to talk about the man, Linus Pauling. We're going to talk about this book project that I released last fall, Visions of Linus Pauling. And then we will talk very briefly about the history of the Linus Pauling Institute of Science and Medicine, which is what LPI was known prior to 1996 when it came to OSU. And that is based on a chapter that is in the book. And I'm going to kind of zip through this as quickly as I can because I want to make sure we've got plenty of time for Q&A at the end. But first, a little bit about me. As Alex mentioned, I've been here a while, so I'm an archivist. I work in the Special Collections and Archives Research Center at Oregon State University Libraries, and I have done for 27 years almost. Linus Pauling donated his papers to Oregon State University Libraries in 1986. And in 1996, I arrived, and in 2006, the Pauling papers were fully processed and published for use by whoever wanted to use them. And I was deeply enmeshed in that process, that 10-year process of processing those papers. I've also been closely connected with a number of digital projects related to Pauling, digital exhibits and digital collections. And a little bit more recently, I've done a fair bit of oral history work related to Linus Pauling as well. So I've been closely connected to Pauling for a long time, and I've gotten to know him pretty well from the inside out. Well, who was this guy, Linus Pauling? We can see from the photo on the right that he's the recipient of 2 Nobel Prizes. In fact, he's the only person to have received 2 unshared Nobel Prizes. There are a few people who've received 2 prizes, but they've always been shared. Pauling's the only one to have received 2 unshared prizes. So that's part of his legacy. And we can get a sense of sort of the sweep of that legacy by taking a look at the titles of some of the biographies that have been published over the years. And these are just a small handful. There's been a lot of them. But biographers have called him in the titles of their books a force of nature, a man of intellect and action, scientist and advocate, scientist and crusader, scientist and peacemaker. So he was certainly a lot of things. Let's try to dig in a little bit deeper. Well, he's definitely an Oregonian. So he was born in Portland in 1901, and he grew up in Portland and in a little town in eastern Oregon called Condon, where his dad was a pharmacist. He went to high school in Portland. He didn't graduate. He attended Washington High School in Portland and left before graduating because he wanted to go to college. And where he went to college was Oregon Agricultural College in Corvallis, Oregon, which is what Oregon State University was known prior to 1927. So Oregon Agricultural College is a land-grant school. It was relatively small back then. It was very, very focused on practical learning in connection with the land-grant mission. And Pauling, pretty much from the very beginning, was interested a lot in theory and interested in advancing theory and understanding theory. And there wasn't a whole lot of that available to him at OAC. So it wasn't a perfect match necessarily, but it was vitally important for at least a couple of reasons. And number one is that it was accessible. Pauling came from a very modest background financially, and any possibility for him to attain a higher education would have to come from a place that wasn't going to be expensive. And Oregon Agricultural College was actually free. There was no tuition charged back then. There were some fees associated with certain classes that needed extra supplies. And you had to find a way to pay room and board, of course, but there was no tuition. So this was accessible. It was a bridge to him. It was a bridge between one set of possibilities and a whole other world of possibilities for him later on. So super important. Also, Oregon Agricultural College is where he met Ava Helen Miller. So Ava Helen, also a native-born Oregonian, and a student at Oregon Agricultural College in home economics. They met during Pauling's senior year, and a year later, they were married, and they were together for nearly 60 years as a married couple before she died in 1981. She was far and away the most important person in his life, and we will check back in with her here in a little bit. A structural chemist par excellence. So there's lots that could be said about Pauling and structural chemistry, and I'll just surface a couple details. One is that he was really good at solving crystal structures. So if he had experimental data from the laboratory, and he did a lot of this in the 20s and 30s with things like rocks and minerals, if he had that experimental data, he was really good at forming a hypothesis that made sense about what this molecule might actually look like on the molecular level. And he published lots of these structures in the 20s and 30s, and that was a significant contribution. But it really paled in comparison to his contributions to the theory of structural chemistry. So more than any other person, Pauling is the person most responsible for developing the modern conception of how atoms form into molecules. And he did this by partly by accident, well, not by accident, by circumstance. He was in the right place at the right time. He was in Europe in the mid-1920s on a Guggenheim Fellowship. And he was in a position to learn quantum mechanics as it was essentially being invented by these great European scientists he was interacting with. So he learns this new physics, and he begins to apply it to some pretty musty ideas about structural chemistry that are due for some revision. And he starts to publish a series of papers in the 1930s that bear the prefix "The Nature of the Chemical Bond." And in 1939, he publishes a book by that same name, The Nature of the Chemical Bond, which is recognized as an instant classic, and it goes through multiple editions, and it sells very well. And in 1954, Pauling receives the Nobel Chemistry Prize for essentially that work, his work on the nature of the chemical bond, his first Nobel Prize, and also the first time that the Nobel Foundation, or the Nobel Chemistry Group at least, had given a chemistry prize for a body of work rather than a single aha moment. That was something that was very important to Pauling, the fact that his body of work was recognized in that way. Also a founder of molecular biology. And if you don't believe me, believe Francis Crick, who said exactly that at a talk that he gave at OSU in 1995. And again, lots of things that could be said about Pauling and molecular biology, but I'll surface two points here represented by these two images. On the left, the oil painting of Pauling next to the alpha helix. So I mentioned Pauling is really good at solving crystal structures in the 20s and 30s, working on rocks and minerals. In the 30s and 40s, he switches gears and starts to approach more complicated structures, biological structures, beginning with hemoglobin, and then moving into multiple investigations of different types of proteins. So in the midst of that, he comes up with this notion of the alpha helix, which, as it turns out, is a fundamental building block of lots of different types of proteins. And once established, this really accelerates both his work as a chemist who's working on the structure of these large organic biological molecules like proteins, as well as lots of other scientists who are trying to do the same thing. So the alpha helix is a big deal. On the right, we see a stamp that was released by the Postal Service, the United States Postal Service, in 2008. In the foreground, an image of Pauling, and in the background, images of molecules. And so some of those molecules are healthy hemoglobin cells, and there are also sickled hemoglobin cells as well. So the stamp is representative of his work on molecular disease. So Pauling and his group are the first people to experimentally prove that there is such a thing as a molecular disease. They did this in the late 1940s, and the disease that they isolated was sickle cell anemia. So sickle cell anemia is a disease that locates its source in the molecular level. In the years following, there's been several other diseases that have been described in a similar way, but the sickle cell anemia was the first time that this was done. It was done by Pauling's group. And remember this stamp, because we'll return to it here in a few slides. A committed activist. So Pauling was essentially apolitical prior to 1945, very much focused on science and less interested in world affairs. But at the end of World War II, the United States drops atomic bombs over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and Pauling and many other scientists have their eyes really opened by this because they can understand the magnitude of energy released by these weapons and the import that the new nuclear era is going to have on the history of the world. And so Pauling decides that he, A, needs to educate himself more on these issues, and B, ultimately needs to speak out about them. And so he sort of casts about for a while and is interested in lots of different topics and speaks in lots of different topics, but ultimately he isolates something that he thinks he can make a difference on and that he thinks is super important. And that is radioactive fallout from nuclear weapons tests in the atmosphere. So these days, we take it for granted that if you detonate a nuclear bomb in the atmosphere, that fallout is going to come back down to the Earth and it's going to have harmful effects. But in the 1950s, there was no strong political consensus behind this. And so Pauling wanted to try to generate that political consensus by really strengthening and affirming the scientific consensus behind this idea that we should not be detonating nuclear weapons in the atmosphere because fallout's going to come back down and cause bad things for the Earth. So the way that he did this, and he had a lot of assistance from Eva Helen in this activity, was to circulate a petition around the world that went just to scientists at different universities around the world, advocating against above ground nuclear testing, again, saying that fallout is a thing and it's a bad thing that we need to avoid. So in 1958, he submits that petition to the United Nations. It has over 11,000 signatures in it. And in 1963, the Soviet Union, the United States, and Great Britain agreed to what they call the Partial Test Ban Treaty, or the Limited Test Ban Treaty, in which they decided that they, yes, will still continue to test nuclear weapons, but they're not going to do it in the atmosphere anymore. It's going to be underground. And so on the day that that treaty went into effect, in late August of 1963, the Nobel Foundation also announced that Pauling would receive the Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts in bringing this about. A lot of people feel that Eva Helen should have shared in that prize, but times being what they were, it went specifically to Linus Pauling. And at that point, as I said, he became the first and still only person to receive 2 unshared Nobel Prizes. Well, that wasn't the end of his activism by any stretch. In the 70s, he was very vocal, demonstrating against the Vietnam War. In the 80s, against nuclear proliferation in the Reagan era and things like the Strategic Defense Initiative or Star Wars. And in the early 1990s, just a couple years before he died, he was speaking out against the first Gulf War in Iraq. A steadfast advocate of vitamin C. So Pauling is most popularly known by a lot of people as being the vitamin C guy. And the reason why is because he was preoccupied with this topic for really the last 3 decades of his life. And so this begins in the mid-1960s when he meets a guy named Erwin Stone, who was a biochemist and somebody who had been interested on a scholarly level and also a personal level in the potential health impacts of vitamin C. And Stone passes along some literature and some intriguing anecdotal information about vitamin C and its possible, the possibilities that it might be really helpful to human health. And the basic idea is this. So human beings are one of a very small number of animal species on the planet that are not capable of synthesizing their own internal vitamin C. So if you put a human being on a boat and ship them out to sea for a couple of months and they don't bring the right type of food with them, they'll die of scurvy because they have to have vitamin C and they cannot produce it themselves. Pauling believed that this had happened kind of as a fluke of evolution. But because we're not able to synthesize our own internal vitamin C, and every other animal basically is, Pauling also believed that we were living in a state of constant suboptimal health. And so he started to do some research, he and some looking at the amounts of ascorbic acid that other animals are generating and developing some crosswalks between their production and our non-production and drawing some conclusions about what would be ideal for human beings. And that's when he starts to talk about megadoses of vitamin C. So the intake of very large amounts of vitamin C to try and arrive at optimal health. At various points in his life, he was taking between 10 to 15 grams of vitamin C, which is way more than the 60 milligrams that was expressed by the RDA as recommended. The level of vitamin C, by the way, that will keep you from getting scurvy, 60 milligrams. So this work sort of hits the popular attention in the early 70s with a book called Vitamin C in the Common Cold. Later on, he and a Scottish physician by the name of Ewan Cameron, who we'll also talk about more in a bit, published a book called Cancer and Vitamin C, in which they're really up in the ante. They're talking about vitamin C as a possible form of treatment for people with cancer to either improve quality of life, to slow the progression of the disease, or in certain cases to actually reverse the progression of the disease. Later on in his life, he did not publish. He wrote a lengthy manuscript on vitamin C and AIDS, and then after that did some work on vitamin C and heart disease as well. So this was a really big deal for him. As I say, it was a preoccupation for the last 30 years of his life. a survivor of hardships, and there were many. There's only two that I'll mention here, though. So on the left, we see a photo of Herman Pauling, Linus's dad, and in his lap is little Linus. You can see his eyes poking out, and then baby Pauline. Linus Pauling was the oldest of three kids, Pauline born in 1903, and then Lucille born in 1904. I mentioned that Herman Pauling was a pharmacist, and he did his best to try to make ends meet. There was hard times often, and he had some stomach problems, and he ultimately died of those stomach problems of an ulcer. And he died in 1910 when Linus Pauling was 9 years old. So at that point, it was Linus and his mom and his two sisters, and Linus had to start working essentially to try to make ends meet. So he did a lot of little kid jobs. He delivered newspapers. He delivered milk from the back of a horse-drawn wagon. He was a pin boy at a bowling alley for a while. And then a little bit later on, he worked as a drill press operator at a machine shop. And the drill press operator job attracted a pretty good wage. And his mom tried to convince him to make a career out of it. But thankfully, Pauling was not interested in that life. He was interested in science. And as I mentioned, Oregon Agricultural College existed as a bridge to get him from this very humble background to a new world of possibilities. But obviously, the experience of losing his father when he was 9 years old made a profound impact on him in lots of ways, as the ways that we might expect, also building in this really strong work ethic that he carried through for the rest of his life, and a fastidiousness about money that he also carried with him for the rest of his life. That experience of scarcity as a child stuck with him for sure. On the right is Thomas Addis, who was a medical physician at Stanford University. And he was a crucial person in Pauling's story. So in the mid-1940s, Pauling was diagnosed with a kidney disease called glomerular nephritis, which was basically a death sentence back then. There was not a well fully accepted protocol for treating it that actually worked. There was a protocol that kind of worked for a little while, but actually would hasten people. Usually they would die. And so Pauling was not in a good position. But thankfully, he didn't choose to go that route of the standard protocol. He chose to work with this guy, Addis, and take a different route. And the route that was proposed was essentially Pauling's first connection with orthomolecular medicine, or this idea of the right molecules and the right amounts to obtain optimum health. And those molecules often coming from dietary means or supplementary means, vitamins and minerals. So Addis's notion was that Pauling's kidneys were weak and they needed to give them as much rest as possible. So he proposed a diet that was low in protein, low in salt, drink lots of water. And this is a diet that Pauling followed for many years, and it worked. His kidneys rehabilitated themselves and he survived. So obviously an extremely important moment personally, because he continued to live, but also professionally as well. This notion of orthomolecular medicine clearly stuck with Pauling. By the image on the left, the Pauling-Corey triple helix structure of DNA. So this is a model that was made by a student of Pauling's, Farouk Hussein, many years later. So DNA, and this is a well-known story. Watson and Crick published their double helix in April of 1953. Pauling and Corey had submitted their triple helix a few months before that in December of 1952, and it was famously wrong. And there was lots of reasons why, and we can talk more about that in Q&A if people are interested. But I think the thing that sticks with me is the triple helix actually violated the principles that Pauling himself had put forth in his textbook, General Chemistry, which was a book that sold very well. A famous blunder and a massive opportunity lost. It's interesting to think about what Pauling's legacy would look like if in addition to all of his achievements, he also was the person who had come up with the correct structure for DNA, but he didn't. And that was something that stuck with him. On the right is a controversy or a moment that is less well known, but documented pretty well for people who are interested. And it's on something called quasi-crystals. So the mid-1980s, an Israeli scientist by the name of Dan Shechtman published a paper where he posited this idea of quasi-crystals, which were these atomic structures that, for the sake of this conversation, exhibited really odd and mysterious and intriguing properties. And the quasi-crystals did not match up with what Pauling's idea of the world was. And so he kind of made it his mission to rebut them. And this went on for several years. So Pauling died in 1994. This work is happening in 1985. There was a good chunk of time in those last 9 years of his life where he's thinking about quasi-crystals and trying to rebut them. And he gets a little bit aggressive about it, and frankly, a little bit rude in some of his rhetoric. He actually referred to Sheckman as being a quasi-scientist at one point. But the arguments that Pauling was making started to get more and more outlandish as time moved forward. And he was publishing these ideas about structures that were enormous and extremely complicated, specifically because they were something that wasn't quasi-crystals. And he was wrong. So he died in 1994. And in 2011, Sheckman received the Nobel Chemistry Prize for his work on quasi-crystals. So that's an example of Pauling being incorrect and being stubborn and being a human being. Okay, so Visions of Linus Pauling, this book that I published last fall. Its prehistory is in a blog, the Pauling blog. And remember the stamp that we saw from Pauling's sickle cell anemia work from 2008? That was the genesis for the Pauling blog. So we knew that the stamp was going to come out, we in Special Collections in the library. And we wanted to do something to try to spread the word a little bit and let people know about this stamp. So we decided we were going to start a blog. And the first few posts were about the stamp. So mention of the stamp release event that happened at OSU, and also a little bit of research on the history of Pauling and stamps, because the 2008 stamp was actually the fourth time he had appeared on a stamp. So we made that little graphic that you see on the left, and we talked about this. And it was really head in a much broader, different direction with the Pauling blog. And what we did was we just used this as a space for us to explore topics that we felt were underrepresented or hadn't been discussed at all by biographers, because we had access to the papers and we had the means to do the research. So for the next 13 years, from 2008 to 2021, we did a lot of writing. You can see 865,000 words in total. And this was a project that I spearheaded the entire time, but I certainly didn't write everything. There's 38 different people who have contributed to the Pauling blog, mostly students at OSU, undergraduates and graduate students. So the way it would typically work is I would have an idea for something to do research on. I would point the student in the direction of the parts of the collection where they should do the research. They would do the research, they would write a manuscript, I would edit it, and then publish it along with illustrations. And that's what we did for those 13 years. Well, in the fall of 2020, I received an email from an editor at World Scientific, which is a publishing house based in Singapore, asking me if I was interested in taking pieces of the blog and turning it into a book. I was very flattered by this and said yes, and then immediately thought, well, how am I going to do this? As we're going from a resource of 865,000 words to a print book that had a word cap of 120,000. And so I thought about it for a while, and then I just decided to, again, lean on that the original motivating foundation for the blog itself, which is to think about what have we done that is novel, that hasn't been touched upon by any other biographer, or what have we done that is taking a deeper dive into a subject that I think is interesting and important. And those are the principles of selection that I used in curating the chapters that went from blog posts into what has now appeared in this book. So here's some selected contents. There, as it says in the bottom, there's 23 chapters total, almost 400 pages. But the book begins with a lengthy biographical sketch of Pauling that I've written. And that is to provide some grounding for people who are not very well familiar with his story, because a lot of the chapters in here can seem a little bit esoteric if you don't have any connection with him at all. But the biographical sketch provides a nice broad overview and would allow people to anchor their understanding of the chapters into a larger context or larger narrative of his life. Writing the Nature of the Chemical Bond is actually the first full chapter in the book. And in it, we talk about Pauling's experience of writing the book, Nature of the Chemical Bond. So this is, as I mentioned, an extremely important book that garnered him a Nobel Prize. And the contents of the book and its impact have been discussed by plenty of other scholars. But to my knowledge, nobody has talked about his actual experience of writing it. And it's actually a really interesting story. He wrote the book when he was on fellowship at Cornell University in 1937. And so he's in Ithaca, New York, and he's there by himself for the most part. And the lonelier he gets, the more productive he gets with this book. And it's been interesting to trace that the waxing and waning of his productivity based on whether or not he had anybody there to talk to, basically. So again, an interesting slant on a topic that's already been covered in some areas, but not in this way. W.H. Freeman and Company is a publishing house that Pauling was affiliated with for many, many years. Not only as an author, they published many of his books, but also as an editor, which I think a lot of people don't know. He had his own line of books that fell under his imprimatur, the Pauling brand. And this is a topic that hasn't been discussed by any other biographers, as far as I know, his relationship with W.H. Freeman and Company. So we're able to detail that. We're able to see how the company rose in stature, in esteem, and in financial things going well financially, in part because of their connection with Pauling, and vice versa. He was able to build his brand as well, both as an author as an editor, which is pretty interesting to see. Stuck on a cliff in 1960, Pauling went on a hike, and he had owned some property near the Pacific Ocean at Big Sur, and he and Eva Helen would go there often, and they had a little house. He went for a hike one day, told her he was going on a hike, and he was sort of scrambling up a hill at one point, and at some point found himself in a bit of a pickle. He was in a spot where he couldn't go up anymore, but was afraid to go down, so he was stuck. And this was in January, and he had left in the early afternoon, and by then the night was falling and the fog was coming in. And Eva Helen was worried, and she called some people to go on a search. They went in the wrong direction because she had seen him go one direction, but he kind of doubled back. And he had to spend the night on the cliff. So again, January, he had a light jacket. He had a map with him. He wrapped himself up in the map to try and stay warm. And then he did whatever he could to stay awake. And because he was afraid if he fell asleep, he was going to fall into the ocean to his death. So he counted as high as he could in all the languages he could think of. He recited the periodic table, and he said he lectured to the stars as well. And that's what got him through the night. And thankfully, the next day he was discovered and he was okay. But there had been actually one or two journalistic reports that he died over the course of that evening when he was stuck on a cliff. So obviously a traumatic moment that we're able to tell that story in great detail because of our access to all the records that we have of that moment. Patents, this is another one that hasn't been talked about by anybody. Pauling filed multiple patent applications over the course of his life for all different kinds of things. But this is a space for us to engage, I think, most interestingly, with his scientific war work. So Pauling did a lot of work for the U.S. government during World War II. He invented an oxygen meter that was used in submarines and aircraft, and after the war in incubators for premature babies. He invented something called oxypolygelatin, which was an artificial blood plasma substitute. He worked on rocket propellants and secret inks. And a lot of this stuff he thought was patentable, and some of it he was able to get patents on. Some of it he wasn't for issues of national security. But we're able to tell that story and lots of other stories through this lens of his patent applications. A funny story from Andy Warhol is short. It's from Andy Warhol's diary, and it's about Warhol and Pauling sort of accidentally having dinner together at this banquet, and Pauling's fondness for desserts really is really what it boils down to. And it's an amusing little anecdote, but it's also representative of what I've tried to do with the book, which is to include some short pieces that sort of serve as a bit of a palate cleanser between these longer, more in-depth and heavier texts. And also that shed light on Pauling as a person. And then Pauling's last years. So this is the story of his final illness and his death. And one of the things that really emerged from that is a greater understanding of the treatments that he sought out, specifically a really, at that time, very experimental treatment that sort of was a precursor to some of the immunotherapy treatments that are becoming more and more prominent now. But this is a treatment that Pauling didn't really have a whole lot of faith in. He didn't really think it was going to work necessarily, but he was committed to it in part because he knew that by being committed to it, he'd be able to add to the body of scientific information about that treatment. So this is a very high stakes decision that he's making, but he was a scientist until the end, and that's been fascinating to see that. Okay, so one of the chapters of the book is a history of the Linus Pauling Institute of Science and Medicine, and we're going to talk very briefly about some of that stuff. There's a lot more detail than I'm able to get into in this presentation in the book if people are interested. But let's talk about the genesis of LPISM. So Pauling left Caltech in 1963. He'd been there for over 40 years. Things kind of fell apart at the end because of his political work, and he left. And he bounced around from institution to institution for a little while, and he ultimately matriculated at Stanford. And he was at Stanford for 6 or 7 years. And this is when the vitamin C work is really starting to take off. And he's really enthusiastic about it. So he asks Stanford to support it in the form of a facility where he can do that work. And Stanford was disinclined to doing that. So Pauling decided, well, I'm just going to do it on my own then. So he left Stanford and he decided to found his own institute, the Institute for Orthomolecular Medicine. It It was co-founded by three people: Linus Pauling, Art Robinson, who was originally a student of Pauling's at Caltech, and then later a colleague of his at the places that he went after Caltech, and also a name that's known to many of us in Oregon through his political work. So he's run for office at multiple levels, multiple times, and he's currently a state senator from Cave Junction in Southern Oregon. And then the third co-founder is a guy named Keen Dimmick, who was not really connected at all to the scientific side of the Institute, as far as I know. But Keen Dimmick, he was a biochemist and had a career in science, but he also was the inventor of the first electronic stationary bicycle, and he made a lot of money off of that. So he was essentially a financial investor in the early years of the Institute. And so there is a photo of its first location, which was an office building in Menlo Park, California. They shared space with an insurance company. There was no wet lab facility, at least at the beginning, but it was a start. So if we go decade by decade, in the 1970s, we surface an issue that never really went away: chronic funding problems. So the Institute had a hard time attracting grants because the work it was doing was unorthodox. It was a fledgling, nascent group, and Pauling was controversial. And so it was hard to get the kinds of big grants that a research institute needs to sustain itself. So it had to rely on private donations and had to get a little bit creative. And Pauling was part of that creativity. So he wrote a couple books that he donated the proceeds to the Institute. At various points also, he sort of traveled around barnstorming, giving lectures, and he would donate his fees for the lectures to the Institute as well. So, and at various points was donating half to all of his salary to the Institute as well. So he was doing everything he could to try to keep it afloat. A few important hires that I'll mention here, and the first one was directly related to that funding problem: Rick Hicks. So Rick Hicks came from a financial background, and he was a professional fundraiser. And he interjected a lot of ideas and built relationships and connections that were crucial to the Institute's survival over the course of the next 25 years or so. Steve Lawson was also originally hired to support fundraising. He was involved with a direct mail campaign related to fundraising. That was just the very beginning of Steve's association with the Institute. He pretty quickly moved over to the scientific side of the operations, and later on moved into administration, as we'll see. Ewan Cameron, I mentioned earlier, the Scottish physician with whom Pauling did a lot of his early cancer and vitamin C work. He eventually became a research fellow at the Institute and an employee. And then Emil Zuckerkandl was a scientist with whom Pauling had worked on some evolutionary concepts at Caltech in the late 50s and early 60s. And he was very well respected, Zuckerkandl was, and he came more from the molecular biology side of things than from the orthomolecular medicine side of things. So he brought some scientific gravitas to the operations, and he also moved into administration in the 1980s. So I mentioned that Pauling and Cameron are doing this high-profile cancer research. They published this book, Cancer and Vitamin C. It raises eyebrows, and people are interested. And so it leads to a controlled trial run by the National Cancer Institute. And Pauling is really excited about this. Finally, there's a source of research that's going to hopefully validate his work on a level that he's not able to because he doesn't have the resources. So the NCI runs this trial. It runs out of the Mayo Clinic, a prestigious clinic, and it's run by a guy named Charles Martel. And so they do their work, they publish their data, and they conclude that vitamin C has no impact on the treatment of cancer whatsoever. And so this is a big blow. It's very public. It's a kind of a public rebuke of what the Institute is about. And some of that private funding starts to dip because people are thinking, oh, what's this place doing? But Pauling was disinclined to accept their data. And the thing that he pointed out in response to this trial was that they were using subjects who had already been treated with chemotherapy. And Pauling suggested this was a very significant cofactor. And the fact that these people have been treated with chemotherapy, their immune systems were badly damaged, and vitamin C was facing a really significant uphill climb in trying to help these people. And as it turns out, this was a compelling argument and led to a second trial, which we'll talk about here in a second. In the meantime, there's a fair bit of administrative tumult happening at the Institute, which ultimately leads to the departure of Art Robinson, one of the three founders, along with Pauling and Keen Dimmick. And so the essential issue here is that Robinson and Pauling, as I mentioned, were kind of the two people on the ground who were running things. And there was a lack of clarity about who was in charge of what. And at various points, Robinson and Pauling disagreed about the future of the Institute or the direction it should be taking. So Robinson was interested in collaborating with some people within the world of orthomolecular medicine that Pauling was disinclined to collaborate with. Robinson also was interested in moving the Institute to Oregon much earlier than it actually did happen. And Pauling didn't want to do that either. So these disagreements started to get a little bit more heated, and at some point, Pauling dismissed Robinson, and Robinson then consequently sued the Institute, saying that they didn't have the right to dismiss him. And this is a lawsuit that lingered for several years and became expensive and sapped energy and resources. Ultimately settled out of court, but it was like a black cloud hanging overhead for quite a long time. In the 1980s, the Institute leaves the insurance building and moves into a cinder block facility in Palo Alto. Not especially glamorous place, but larger and probably better suited to the work. So that was a step forward. And as I mentioned, there was a second trial run by the National Cancer Institute. So again, Pauling makes this argument about chemotherapy, which is compelling. And also the NCI has a new director who steps in and is more inclined to give it a second try with vitamin C. Once again, it's run out of the Mayo Clinic. Once again, it's run by Charles Martel. And once again, it says that vitamin C is completely useless in treating cancer. And so, and once again, this is a big blow to the Institute publicly. It's a public rebuke. And once again, it leads to a lot of back and forth between Pauling and Martel. This time, Pauling's arguments are based in a couple of different areas. Number one, and most prominently at the time he was making the argument, he said they just didn't run the trial long enough. So with the work that Cameron was doing, Ewan Cameron was doing in Scotland earlier, some of the things he was measuring wasn't just tumor size, it was quality of life, aspects of quality of life for the patients that were being treated with vitamin C. Martel was focused only on tumor size, and when the patient's tumors didn't start to shrink, he would quickly put them onto chemotherapy, at which point, again, the study in terms of vitamin C was rendered moot. So Pauling was quick to point that out. Another thing he pointed out, but didn't emphasize quite as much, was that Cameron had been applying vitamin C or ascorbic acid intravenously, whereas Martel was doing it orally. And this actually turns out to be a really big deal. This is maybe less well understood at that time. Cameron and Pauling knew there's something to it, but these days we know that the transport mechanism for intravenous vitamin C is such that the body is able to absorb a lot more ascorbic acid into the tissues than if taken orally. So these days, I think that would probably be the lead complaint about how the study was designed. But at that point, back then it was mentioned, but it wasn't emphasized quite as much. In any case, another blow to the Institute. In the meantime, the Institute's research agenda is kind of broadening. Emil Zuckerkandl had moved into the presidency of the Institute at this point, and he expressed some interests in areas beyond orthomolecular medicine that were successful, but led to significantly increased overhead for what the Institute was trying to do. So there was a bit of a breakthrough related to chemical bonds and bulk metals. It was a nice little win for the Institute, not something that would necessarily grab the public's fancy, but scientifically it was useful and important. Zuckerkandl was interested in protein sequencing. Pauling and many others, including Zuckerkandl and Steve Lawson, were interested in superconductivity and trying to develop a product that they could bring to market related to superconductivity. And then I mentioned that the vitamin C work was connecting with HIV/AIDS and also cardiovascular disease during this period of time. So some good work, but as I say, overhead associated with it, people that need to be paid, a space that needs to be equipped, and that all costs money. So we move into the 1990s. Ewan Cameron died in 1991, so Pauling lost his primary collaborator on the cancer work at that point. And then there's a change in leadership. So Zuckerkandl and the fundraiser Rick Hicks leave, in part because there's an understanding that the Institute has just gotten too sprawling and can't support all this different types of work. It needs to sort of return to its roots and refocus on orthomolecular medicine. So Zuckerkandl left and started his own institute that was focused more on molecular biology. Hicks went with him as the fundraiser. And in steps Steve Lawson, as we mentioned, originally hired to do some direct mail fundraising and then working on science. And now he's the CEO of the institute. But also in steps Linus Pauling Jr., who was representing the board of trustees. And these two individuals saw that this was a critical moment for the institute. finances were teetering. In 1994, Linus Pauling died, and afterwards, a lot of people were thinking, is it worth keeping the Institute alive anymore? Pauling's died, the finances are in trouble, maybe we should just let this wind up. Well, thankfully, Lawson and Linus Jr. disagreed with that and developed a new plan, which was to try to affiliate with a university. And thankfully, Oregon State University was interested. So I mentioned 1986, Pauling had given his papers to OSU, and of course was also an alumnus. And OSU was inclined to accept the proposal that LPI made that it affiliate with OSU. So in 96, the Institute moves from California to space on the 5th floor of Winter Hall, which for those of us on campus, we know that's a pretty grim space in certain ways, but it was a sanctuary in lots of respects for the Institute, because at this point, they didn't have to pay rent anymore. They were on campus, didn't have to pay rent, and had a connection with a fundraising apparatus through the OSU Foundation that they didn't have to create on their own. So the private side of things are better, lower expenses, and a more well-honed fundraising infrastructure. And then scientifically, the next phase begins with the hire of Baltz Frye as director. It was an inspired hire. Frye was a very well-respected scientist. I looked at his Google Scholar profile recently, and he's been cited over 53,000 times, and so that's a big number. And he was working on oxidative stress. He was working on the mechanisms that cause chronic disease, and he was enmeshed in this kind of tradition of orthomolecular medicine. So he was a perfect person to bring in scientifically, and it turned out he was a very skilled administrator as well. So Dr. Frye is hired as director, and then the first three principal investigators, Tori Hagen, Rhett Traber, and Rod Dashwood, are also brought in. And again, these are people of high renown scientifically, people who are able to bring in grant money. So we have the private side getting covered, and now the grant side is getting covered as well. And you have to have that to be a healthy, growing research institute. And then our last slide here. So the decade of the 2000s, I'll mention the launch of the Micronutrient Information Center, which for people who haven't seen it, please check it out. It's really interesting and really useful. This is a major piece of the Institute's outreach and has been for a long time. And what it is essentially well-written, clean, scientifically documented, accessible information about vitamins, nutrients, minerals, dietary intakes, and what people might be thinking about when they're in different phases of life, essentially. It's written for the lay user, but has concrete science behind it that's well cited and has been heavily used. And as I say, this has been a real success and is a resource that I would encourage people to look at if you're interested in this notion of orthomolecular medicine, or the right molecules and the right amounts to achieve optimum health. Speaking of which, the Diet and Optimum Health conferences have been running biannually since the early 2000s. And so this is a major conference that the Institute has hosted since the early 2000s. And at many of them, they've awarded the Linus Pauling Institute Prize for Health Research. And the honorarium for that award has, over various points, ranged from between $25,000 to $50,000. So this is a major award that the Institute is funding and offering to people who are achieving within this world of diet and optimum health. And it really stands as a pronounced marker from this period of time where the Institute almost ceased to exist. Now we're able to have these conferences and we're able to offer this major prize. But the crescendo of it all is the opening of the Linus Pauling Science Center in 2011. So we've gone from the insurance building to the center block facility to the 5th floor of Winter Hall to now this beautiful building that was at the time the largest academic building on the campus of OSU. $62 million project, and one of the centerpieces of the OSU capital campaign, which raised over $1 billion to advance the university's mission. So this is, as I say, the crescendo of the story that we'll tell here today. It was, as Linus Pauling Jr. said at the dedication event, the phoenix rising from the ashes. And so there we are. We will end the history with that, and I will be happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Okay, Chris, thank you for that presentation. That was great. I really enjoyed looking back at all the parts of Linus Pauling's life and learning more about Linus Pauling as a man. And of course, hearing more about the Institute. I mean, I always like listening to our history. Unfortunately, I just noticed that we are over time at the moment, so I'm going to have to wrap things up today. But I'd like to thank you, Chris, for coming out. And we've got all of your questions recorded, the questions that people have submitted for Chris recorded. So we will try to address them in some way, especially if they're on the history of Pauling and the book. I'm going to make another plug for Visions of Linus Pauling, which you can find online, Amazon or other online retailers that you can buy it, and or to go to the World Scientific site. But Chris, it was great talking to you again, and I hope you can help me answer some of these questions that are coming in as we speak.
Be happy to. Thank you very much, Alex.
All right. And now I'd like to bring Emily back online so we can wrap things up today.
Thank you again, Chris, for such a great presentation. I'm sure I'm not alone. I learned a lot, both about Dr. Pauling and the origins of our institute. Really, truly an amazing person, an amazing life, and a big inspiration for so many. So I hope our listeners were also equally inspired and enjoyed the presentation. I see some comments that people really enjoyed it, and people who've read the book have also really enjoyed the book as well. So thank you. I do want to remind people, though, events like this are only possible because of the generous support of generous donors to the Institute, like many of you already are. So if you appreciate these webinars or other resources that the Institute has, I encourage you to consider supporting the Institute. Any amount that you give is going to help us bring more of this information to you, either through webinars, the Micronutrient Information Center, et cetera, in the future. So if you're considering to give, I also want to reiterate that OSU has their annual Day of Giving in a couple of weeks on April 26th. So if you are so inclined and want to support us, consider helping us meet some of our challenge goals so we can unlock some of those additional gifts and challenge gifts that we have for Damn Proud Day. We'll be sending out links to everyone soon, both about the webinar in terms of revisiting it on YouTube. We'll send out the blog website as well, but and you'll be able to hear about some of the upcoming webinars as well. So the next webinar, we're hoping to highlight some of our newest faculty that we have at the Institute. So you'll hear more pretty soon. We'll have that announcement, speakers, dates for you hopefully pretty soon. So with that, on behalf of everyone here at the Institute, thank you for attending, and we'll see you again soon. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.